The sea is warm against your skin, salt stinging your lips as you rise for breath. Sunlight flickers through the waves, and for a moment the world is only play. You hear your father's distant shout from the shore, his voice thinned by wind, but then the horizon shifts. White sails crest above the blue, embroidered with the imperial standard. The sight stills your heartbeat, because everyone knows what such ships mean. A moment ago you were only a boy in the water. Now you are prey. Content warning. This story confronts historical child exploitation. It will be told without graphic description, but with dignity for those silenced by time. We will uncover how an island, a palace, and an emperor fused into a machine of coercion. Before the first order was given, the island itself had already chosen the boys who would never leave. Capri rises from the Bay of Naples like a shard of myth thrust into the sea. Sailors see its cliffs long before they touch land, jagged walls of limestone plunging straight into the surf. The island is beautiful, but its beauty conceals its prison-like nature. Few beaches soften its edges, and the currents swirling in the surrounding waters punish even the strongest swimmer. What appears as paradise from afar is, up close, a barricade of stone and tide. Once you arrive, leaving becomes another matter entirely. The emperor knew this. When he withdrew from Rome, he did not vanish into obscurity. He retreated to Capri precisely because it offered both spectacle and secrecy. Perched atop the island's heights, his villas commanded views in every direction. Marble staircases wound across terraces cut into the rock, where colonnades opened toward the horizon. Pools shimmered in courtyards, their surfaces reflecting sky and torchlight alike. Even in silence, the structures whispered of power. These palaces were not merely houses, they were machines designed to enforce distance. Visitors climbed steep approaches, funneled through corridors that bent and narrowed until the landscape itself demanded submission. Windows framed the sea as if it were artwork, reminding all within of how far they had travelled to reach this place, and how far it would be to return. The architecture created both awe and isolation, but isolation required maintenance. Capri bristled with watchtowers and signal stations, their fires visible on clear nights across the bay. Imperial patrols scanned the waters for approaching ships. The ports that did exist were small and guarded, their entrances chiselled to restrict the size of incoming vessels. Even the supply of fresh water was regulated, collected in vast cisterns beneath the villas. Every servant, every guard, every attendant lived within a web of control. Their silence was enforced not just by oath but by the physical impossibility of escape. Inside the palaces, the design carried a subtler purpose. Certain pools, for example, were engineered with careful attention to temperature. Some were warmed through concealed channels, others fed by colder springs. The routines surrounding these waters were more than luxury. They created structure, dictating when bodies moved, when they rested, and how long they could endure. Stone basins and flowing fountains became instruments of rhythm and order, tools by which the emperor shaped time as well as space. The villa's walls could echo. A whisper might carry across a chamber, and a cry might vanish into stone. Torchlight flickered across mosaics that depicted gods and heroes, but the stories those walls heard were never carved into marble. Servants hurried along concealed passages, their movements hidden from sight yet woven into the daily machinery of the place. The island demanded service, but erased those who served. To outsiders, Capri was a retreat. To those within, it was an enclosure. The emperor's gaze stretched across the Mediterranean, yet the island's gaze turned inward, watching itself, preserving secrets. What happened here was muffled by limestone, wrapped in tides, and cloaked by distance from Rome's scrutiny. Even rumours, when they reached the capital, were softened or distorted, travelling like smoke through shifting winds. The cliffs stood indifferent, catching sunlight at dawn, shadow at dusk. Fishermen in nearby waters might glimpse the villas glinting above and wonder at the luxury hidden there. But they also knew what it meant when imperial ships moored beneath those walls. They knew better than to ask questions. The empire's reach was long, and Capri's silence was enforced not only by its rocks but by the fear that travelled home in whispers. This is how an island becomes more than geography, it becomes an accomplice. Every path, every chamber, every guarded harbour reinforced the same truth. Once you were within Capri's grasp, you were shaped by its design. You could not simply walk away. The sea barred you. The cliffs confined you. The watchtowers reminded you of who was master here. Yet, an island, however imposing, cannot choose its own inhabitants. Its cliffs may keep secrets, but they cannot fetch them. Someone had to decide who would be brought across those waters. Someone had to gather, to sort, to deliver, and that machinery, the machinery of selection, was already in motion. The island waited in silence, but the empire was never still. Across the coastlines of Campania and beyond, administrators moved like shadows. They did not arrive with fanfare or banners, but with wax tablets and seals. To villages, they brought the language of the state, lists, quotas, and instructions delivered as though they were routine orders in a vast bureaucracy. Yet behind the formality of ink and parchment lay something far more intimate and devastating: the quiet identification of boys who would never return. Surveillance in the ancient world did not need spyglasses or wires. It required only trained eyes and official authority. Scouts lingered near marketplaces, festivals, and harbours, taking note of features, strength, or the ease with which a child might be persuaded. Every entry was reduced to shorthand: age, village, father's name, distinguishing mark. In these notes, lives became abstractions, entries in an imperial ledger. The approach to families was cloaked in ambiguity. Sometimes a messenger came bearing vague promises of opportunity service in the emperor's household, a chance at advancement. At other times, the demand was blunt, sealed with the authority of Rome. Parents were left stranded between dread and hope, forced to weigh their loyalty to the empire against the instinct to protect their own. Resistance was dangerous. Compliance was unbearable. Both were traps. Villagers learned to read the signs. A stranger asking too many questions, a rider passing through at dusk, a clerk scribbling quietly at the edge of a gathering, all were warnings. Yet when the imperial summons came, few could oppose it. Local officials often accompanied the process, unwilling accomplices in a chain of authority stretching from distant Rome to the cliff-wrapped villas of Capri. The moment of departure was rarely ceremonial. Boys were gathered in ones and twos, sometimes at night, sometimes under the pretense of training or service. They were placed on carts or small boats and taken toward larger ships waiting offshore. The sea became the empire's corridor of silence, swallowing their cries and carrying them toward a future already decided. On board, the journey was its own kind of confinement. The holds of the ships were dark, damp with the smell of tar and salt. Boys huddled together, whispering in fragments, trying to piece meaning from rumour. Some clung to the idea of Rome, imagining the grandeur they had heard of in tales. Others suspected the truth but lacked words for it. Their language of fear was learned in silence, in the careful watching of guards, in the absence of any explanation. The voyage to Capri was short by nautical standards, but endless in memory. The island appeared on the horizon like a wall rising out of the sea. For some, it was the first glimpse of marble palaces gleaming above the cliffs, radiant under the sun. Beauty and terror merged in that sight, for they sensed instinctively that such grandeur demanded a price. Arrival was ritual without ceremony. The boys were disembarked, herded through checkpoints, inspected as though they were livestock. Records were updated, names written, miswritten, or erased entirely. Some were renamed outright, their identities folded into the emperor's will. The sorting was precise, though cloaked in silence. Those deemed suitable advanced deeper into the villas, while others vanished into roles no one recorded. Bureaucracy concealed cruelty, converting it into procedure. Every stage was deliberate. The architecture of administration matched the architecture of stone. Both were designed to strip away escape, to enforce obedience, to make each step seem inevitable. A family's loss became an entry in an archive. A boy's confusion became a statistic, a body placed where it was required. Paperwork replaced compassion. Routine disguised violence. For the administrators, the process could be justified as duty. For the emperor, it was disguised as necessity, even luxury. For the boys, it was disorientation sharpened into despair. The machinery did not rely on weapons or chains alone. It relied on forms, seals, couriers, and the immense weight of an empire that could transform suffering into paperwork. By the time the children passed through these stages, resistance had already been broken by confusion and distance. They had left their homes, crossed the waters, and stepped into marble corridors where every echo reinforced their separation. The island's design completed what bureaucracy had begun. Inside the villas, silence pressed down like a second skin. Guards looked without speaking, servants guided without explanation. The boys learned quickly that questions only deepened their vulnerability. Their world had narrowed to chambers, courtyards, and routines they did not yet understand. Their names were not their own anymore. The marble itself seemed to breathe around them, dictating where they stood, when they moved, how they waited. Within those walls, time itself was trained into obedience. Inside the marble, the days were drilled into shape until even time obeyed. Inside Capri's walls, the first lesson was silence. The boys were not told rules. They absorbed them in fragments, by watching, by failing, by surviving. You did not speak first. You waited for cues. You anticipated moods before they shifted. Above all, you never drew attention in the wrong way. The marble floors remembered footsteps, and the air carried whispers farther than intended. Every action could echo, and echoes were dangerous. The days settled into a rhythm engineered to break resistance. Morning began with drills in the water. The pools that once seemed like luxuries became arenas of endurance. Boys were ordered to dive, to hold their breath, to move in unison. The salt of the sea and the chill of spring-fed basins seeped into their skin until even their bodies obeyed command. Breath became a measure of loyalty. Stillness became a mark of survival. Architecture dictated motion, and motion dictated mind. Routines branched beyond the pools. Meals arrived at exact times, portions measured with precision. A boy who pleased his overseers might find an extra piece of bread, a warmer tunic, or the luxury of longer rest. One who faltered could be denied not through blows but through absence. A missing ration, a colder chamber. Isolation in corridors where the echo of one's own breathing grew unbearable. The punishments were carved into the fabric of daily life, reminders that survival depended on obedience. Among the boys, hierarchies formed. Some adapted quickly, studying the moods of guards and overseers as if they were maps. Others clung to fragments of childhood, only to find them stripped away with each passing week. The palace demanded that they read silence as language, that they learn to calculate risk with every glance. There was always the figure of the mentor, an older boy who had endured long enough to understand the patterns. He showed newcomers where to stand, when to move, how to avoid danger. His instructions carried the weight of experience. Never meet eyes too directly, never laugh too loudly, never assume a kindness will last. He moved like someone who had memorized the palace itself, each corridor a line in a map etched into his mind. But maps wear thin. His survival was not endless. One day he broke the rhythm, whether from fatigue, miscalculation, or simply the exhaustion of carrying so much fear. The palace had no room for mistakes. His absence was never explained. His place at meals, his shadow at drills, simply vanished. The silence surrounding him was the sharpest lesson of all. Those who remained absorbed the message. Compliance was not enough. One had to anticipate, to erase oneself until nothing could be used against you. The villas rewarded those who could bend their wills into invisibility. They punished those who hesitated, even once. In this way, the palace did not just control bodies, it reshaped minds. Every corridor reinforced the transformation. The polished marble reflected not faces but fragments of them, distorted by angles of light. The boys saw themselves fractured, their identities splintered by surfaces that gave no whole image. Nights were restless, filled with the soft scrape of sandals in distant halls and the muffled splash of water where drills continued even in moonlight. The villa was never entirely at rest, and so the boys were trained into silence, into precision, into the narrowing of the self. What had begun as bureaucracy was now embodied in their very breath. They learned to count heartbeats underwater, to walk without sound, to speak only when spoken to. Obedience became instinct, not choice. While the emperor remained on Capri, the routine did not relent. The palace was a living organism, one that conditioned, rewarded, and consumed. Each day carved deeper grooves into the minds of those trapped within, until resistance seemed less like courage and more like impossibility. Yet the island was not sealed from the wider world. Across the water, Rome continued to churn with politics, crises, and ambition. Messages travelled like weather, shifting the moods of the emperor and, with him, the fate of those under his roof. While boys learned to read currents, Rome sent darker tides toward the island. Far from Rome's clamour, the emperor sat within his marble refuge, a figure both exalted and diminished. His retreat to Capri was not only indulgence, it was necessity. His body, once hardened by campaigns, now sagged under the weight of age and illness. Breathing came harder, his gait slowed. Each gesture bore the tremor of decline. What the capital saw as seclusion was also survival, a man clinging to control as his strength failed him. Yet isolation never severed his grip on power. Dispatches arrived daily, carried across the bay by swift ships. They were read aloud in vaulted chambers, their contents treated like changes in weather. When news was favourable, tribute secured, enemies subdued, the mood of the villa softened. Routines lightened, punishments eased. But when reports brought crisis, rebellion, conspiracy, famine, the atmosphere thickened like storm clouds. The boys felt it most keenly. Their lives rose and fell with the Empire's fortunes, as though they were instruments tuned to the tremors of Rome. The Emperor's paranoia deepened with his frailty. He trusted fewer voices, drew tighter circles around himself. Where once he had commanded vast audiences, now he surrounded himself with silence punctuated by whispers. The villa mirrored his fears. Guards multiplied, courtyards emptied, schedules grew unpredictable. The boys, already conditioned to anticipate every mood, found the task more perilous as the ruler's temper shortened. A pause too long, a misstep in ritual, could mean disappearance. Decline did not soften him, it sharpened demands. As his body betrayed him, he sought greater control over others. Sessions lengthened, expectations grew harsher. The very routines that had once conditioned now became ordeals, stretching into hours, pressing boys to their limits. Where weakness appeared in him, strength was extracted from them. In the imbalance lay the Emperor's desperate attempt to prove his dominion remained intact. The staff adapted. To them, survival meant normalizing what was abnormal. They spoke in careful tones, kept their eyes lowered, carried on as if this retreat were merely another court. Meals were served with elegance, messages delivered with formality, every act cloaked in the trappings of service. In that performance of normalcy, cruelty became habit. The machinery of silence expanded from the boys to the entire villa, each person complicit by necessity. Beyond Capri, rumours grew. Rome whispered of its absent ruler. Satirists hinted at indulgence. Political rivals sharpened their knives, spinning tales of depravity. Some accounts exaggerated, some invented, but all agreed on one truth. Power had withdrawn from the capital and condensed on a lonely island, where secrecy reigned and witnesses seldom returned. Historians still debate which details reflect reality and which serve propaganda. Yet the consistency of the whispers, their persistence across decades, suggests a kernel too solid to dismiss. Inside the villa, whispers mattered more than chronicles. The Emperor's failing heart set the tempo of life. When he took to his bed, routine slowed. When he rose with fury, they snapped into sharp lines. His decline was not private, it reverberated through the corridors, pressing upon every servant, every guard, every child drawn into his sphere. The island itself seemed to breathe with him, tensing and releasing, shaping lives with every falter of his pulse. And then, inevitably, that pulse would stop. History records the Emperor's death with terse brevity, but the silence it cast over Capri was immense. In Rome it meant succession, politics, the turning of the state. On the island, it meant an exhalation after years of suffocation. Guards looked to one another, servants waited for orders that no longer came. The machinery built around one man fell suddenly still. The boys, conditioned into silence, did not cheer. They carried the weight of their training in their bones. The Emperor's absence did not restore their freedom. It left them stranded in a silence heavier than before. They had lived by his rhythms for so long that his death was less liberation than void. When the Emperor's heartbeat stopped, the island exhaled, but the boys were left holding the silence. The Emperor's death closed Capri like a book suddenly snapped shut. Couriers carried word across the bay, and Rome's machinery lurched into motion succession, ceremonies, new decrees. On the island, however, the change was immediate and eerie. The watchtowers no longer flared with signals. Orders ceased. Servants moved in muted confusion, waiting for direction that would never arrive. The silence that followed was not peace, but suspension, as though time itself held its breath. For the boys, the end brought no clear release. Some were relocated, absorbed into other households of the Empire. Others vanished into records that do not survive, their names dissolving in the sea of unmarked lives. A handful may have returned home, though if they did, their silence was likely their only protection. most simply disappeared from history, erased by design, leaving only absence where their stories should have been. Ancient historians tried to fill that void, but their accounts are tangled with bias. Court chroniclers wrote under political pressure, exaggerating or distorting to tarnish reputations. Later compilers added lurid details, eager to craft moral lessons out of imperial decline. Yet despite the embellishment, a striking consistency threads their narratives. The emperor's retreat, the island's secrecy, the exploitation masked by marble and myth. Modern historians sift through these accounts with caution, weighing propaganda against probability. What emerges is less a catalogue of acts than a portrait of a system, an emperor, an island, and a bureaucracy that allowed such horrors to unfold. Capri itself remains. The villas have crumbled, their stones scattered by centuries, but terraces still cling to cliffs, and pools carved into rock still glint with sunlight. Tourists walk where silence once reigned, admiring views too beautiful to betray what they once contained. The sea rolls endlessly against the limestone, washing away all trace of cries that once vanished into its winds. This is the burden of memory. History preserves the names of rulers, their decrees, their monuments. The children caught within their power rarely leave so much as an inscription. They are remembered only as shadows in hostile accounts, as faceless figures in whispered rumours, yet their absence is its own testimony, a silence we are compelled to witness. To tell their story is not to indulge in the lurid, but to refuse forgetting. What happened on Capri was shaped by architecture, politics, and fear, but at its core were children whose lives were consumed and erased. We may never recover their names, but we can refuse to let their suffering vanish into marble. If this helped you see past the marble, subscribe and keep looking with us, because what we witness shapes what we allow.